As chess players, we become used to certain predictable structures and piece formations. Strong players can often calculate very long variations in the blink of an eye because of pattern recognition. This is part of our edge over computers. We know that this flows into that, which flows into the other thing, and so 7 moves from the current position are completely predictable because certain indicative elements of the position are as familiar as Mama's cooking. But what happens when all the landmarks disappear? There are certain chess players whose style is based on this very question. They make the position so atypical that both players seem to be floating in space. Arthur Kogan is one such player. A charismatic free spirit from Israel, he travels the world living a bohemian life and playing chess. Here is a very strange game that he and I played in Budapest in 1995. From the very opening moves, he guided the struggle into unknown territory, and we both did our best to make sense of the madness. Here it is. I had black in this one, and I'm going to start from the very beginning of the game because you'll see that the opening already is quite abnormal. He played knight f3, d5, c4, I played d takes c4, and he played knight a3. Now already this might seem strange to some of you, but in fact this is pretty well-known theory. Now I began to play the first unusual thing. It's a line that I've played for quite some time. a6, knight takes c4, b5. The idea of this opening for black, for those of you who are very interested in opening ideas, is to transpose into a favorable version of the Queen's Gambit Accepted, which later on becomes a structure like this. This would be a typical Queen's Gambit Accepted structure. But White's knight is going to be misplaced on a3, and I've already gained some time with a6 and b5 attacking that knight, so in this type of position, I'll have a good version of a Queen's Gambit Accepted. After b5, the two main moves that White will usually play are knight e3 or knight e5. Against knight e5, there's a very interesting idea which Fischer actually came up with at first, which is to play with f6 and then e5. This may seem at first like a very artificial way to begin a pawn structure in the center, but it's very strong because black's idea is e4, and if White plays e4 himself, pawn's a little weak and he has weakened dark squares in the center. The other idea is for White to play knight e3, and this is the main line, after which black plays bishop b7 and then goes into the Queen's Gambit Accepted type structure, as I described. Kogan played knight a5, from the very beginning doing something that's a little bit strange. And from here the game just gets weirder and weirder. As I mentioned earlier, all chess players get used to certain structures. We get used to having usually some kind of central pawn structure, our pieces somehow centrally placed. In this game already, White has a knight weirdly placed on a5. It's a target, so I should go after it, right? My first move was c5. Queen takes a5 as the obvious threat. What would you do with White? Here most chess players would, with White, immediately think of knight b3 and probably play knight b3, getting out of the way, bring the knight back closer to the center. Here black's game is quite good because I have a nice expansion on the queen side, a little pressure on the center. And I'll be ahead in development. I can play moves like c4, attacking his knight, provoking knight d4. Then I can play Fischer's idea of f6 and e5 if I want to. Or I can also just leave my pawn on c5 and play a move like e6, holding my pawn structure very nicely, and then develop all my pieces. Black's scheme is much more natural than White's. But Kogan had a rather fantastic conception in mind. He played the move b4, a pawn sacrifice, defending his knight, and after c takes b4, queen c2, not defending the knight, but if I take it, then my bishop on c8 hangs with check. From this early in the game, for my bishop on c8 to be hanging, for the c-file to be open, for me to be up a pawn, for White to have a knight placed on a5, this is all very, very strange. So from here on, you'll notice that we both made sense in our own ways of this very, very nonsensical type of chess position. So when we're in unknown territory, we can always fall back on certain questions which are typical of all chess positions. When your opponent plays a move, the first thing you tend to think of is what is his idea, what does he want to do? And very central to White's position right now is the simple idea of queen e4, attacking my rook and making my life very difficult. There's no way for me to defend it. I have to play rook a7, which is an awkward position for the rook, and later on he could play d3 and bishop e3 if he has time. This is in the position for him. So my first move was a logical way to develop and also to prevent him from playing queen e4. I played knight f6. So you'll notice that one way of handling atypical positions is by asking classical questions. He played bishop b2, once again opening up the possibility of queen e4 because you can always take on f6 first and then play it. Here I played bishop d7, moving my bishop away from the queen's attack, so now the threat on his knight is opened up. And here Kogan was forced to play knight b3. Now yes, I'm up a pawn, but my pawns are doubled in the b-file, and that b4 pawn is quite weak. Plus he has, at least for the moment, a little more development than I do. He has pressure on the dark squares, but more than anything, he's dictated the style of the game. Now, it just so happens that I'm a very, very wild player myself. I love things to get crazy. I love to play very aggressive, kind of strange, fantastic positions where you have to come up with creative ideas. That's in my style as well. So I was quite pleased with the way the position went because I'm always ready to meet that kind of challenge. But if he's played more games in this type of flank-oriented positions where he's playing a move like b4, and when you see what he does in the next moves, you'll be snowed and you'll see just how atypical this game will get. He might have a little advantage of being more familiar with this exact type of structure. I played e6, and what did white play now? I'm sure very few of you will get this one. g4. All of your chess principles will tell you that this is a strange, weird, bad move. But this is what it's like to play against some of these guys. They make the position so strange that you get uneasy. You don't know what to hold on to. You don't know where to look because there's nowhere familiar to look. It's like walking into a strange city or a strange country. The language is different. The landmarks are different. The people look different. People sound different. You have to be at peace with the unknown in these types of situations and simply find the best moves, move by move, or find interesting moves. Try to find the little quirks, the little nuances that are different in these types of positions. After g4, what's his idea? Can I take it? Obviously not. Knight takes g4 falls to the same idea he had before. Queen e4. There's a fork of my rook on a8 and my knight on g4. So I can't take it, and what his idea is to play g5, force my knight to move, and to have pressure on the g7 point so I can't develop so easily. He wants to lock down my bishop on f8. So the classical way to deal with somebody who's pressing on the side of the board is to respond by developing, by pressuring into the center. So I played the very straightforward move knight c6, which is quite good, controlling the center a little more, developing. And after g5, I played knight d5. So now my knights are well placed centrally. It's true my bishop is somewhat tied down to f8. It's a very weird position. He shouldn't kick out my knight again with a move like e4, because then the f4 square is weakened. Remember the theme of the space left behind, to slip into the space left behind. That knight is very, very strong. He can't do that. So after knight d5, he played e3, increasing his central control of the f4 and d4 squares, and stopping knight f4. And now I played a move which I think was a little bit too committal. I played the move rook c8. If I had it to do over again, I would have played either queen b6 or h6. And these seem to be very strange moves. h6 challenges his kingside expansion and kind of prepares to do my own atypical type of thing. G takes h6, rook takes h6, activating my rook on the h-file. And queen b6 just develops another piece. The main difference between these two moves and what I played is that they leave open the option of castle and queenside. I kind of locked my king into being in the center or the king side. That's where I felt it would be. I also made the decision that it would be valuable for me to gain a little bit of time developmentally. Rook c8 pressures his queen a little bit because, again, rook and queen being lined up is always good for the rook. So he's going to have to do something about that. But, later on, a very solid position for the black king. Imagine castle and queenside putting the king on b7. The king is very good because I have all of these pawns. My pawn majority is in front of my king, protecting it. This would be very, very solid. On the other hand, I do have a little bit of weakness on the queen side because the pawns are very far advanced. And a basic principle of king safety is that you don't want to push the pawns ahead of your king, which gives breathing room to your king. It's like a draft, and the king can feel the draft. It's kind of a way of explaining it. Here he could use the idea of knight fd4, maybe potentially trading off those knights and then trying to play bishop takes d4 and to utilize the dark squares in a5 and c5. That's the kind of plan that white can try against the black king. But those pawns provide me with quite a bit of protection. The point of playing a move like queen b6 is not that I would necessarily castle queenside, but that I would have the option of castle and queenside. It's good to keep such options open in these types of positions because he might just lunge forward in the king side in a bizarre way and I'll want to run queenside right then once he's overcommitted. But I played rook c8 and he played queen e4. And here once again I narrowed down my decision to two moves. I could either play queen b6 or h6. Why don't you take a minute and try to find which one you would do? What did you come up with? Well, one thing you may have felt in trying to make the decision whether to play queen b6 or h6 is that there was very little to base the decision on. And if you felt this way, you're not wrong. You're actually feeling a core element of this position, which is that queen b6 does one thing. It develops in a kind of strange way. It doesn't really prepare anything specific. h6 pressures the king side in this way, maybe weakens my king a little bit. But on the other hand, it challenges control of the f6 square, so we could trade h and g, and then maybe I could play knight f6 at one point, blocking his bishop's control of the g7 square. They can move my bishop, maybe I can castle. Maybe not, who knows? It's a move that challenges his expansion on the king side. But in trying to decide between h6 and queen b6, we have nothing firm to hold on to. And that's the feeling that you often have when you play such positions as this one, where there's no certainty, there's no familiarity. Once again, there are no landmarks to see to identify where you are. I played queen b6. After bishop d3, then I played h6. You'll notice, of course, that he couldn't maintain a pawn on g5 with h4, because then I would have played h takes g5. He has to take back with a knight, because if he takes with the pawn, I take his rook. The pawn is pinned on the h file. So my playing h6 really did eliminate his idea of having an outpost on the g5 square with a pawn. So I take over control of the f6 square. And he played rook g1. It's very hard in these types of positions to say that one move is much better than the other move. Of course, there'll be positions where a move is much better, but in these types of things where I'm playing queen b6, h6, rook g1, these are all fine developmental moves, increasing the type of pressure that we both have. But there's nothing firm to grab onto quite yet, so we're both trying to make sense of a very complicated, strange position. One plan for me, you'll notice, is the idea of playing a5 and a4, but that takes some time, and he has plans on the king side. I played h takes g5, rook takes g5. He's threatening the g7 point. What would you play here? Black to move. This is one of those positions in which all the strange things that are happening come to a head. When a queen is placed on e4, you don't really think about trapping it. But notice that in this position, his queen has very, very little room to run. The only square for it is the g4 square. In atypical positions, sometimes you have to look for atypical realities. Now, f5 right away doesn't do anything, because he can just take it with the rook. My e6 pawn is pinned. But I could have tried the idea of bishop e7, a very interesting move which leads to tremendous complications. Let's look at what would happen. First of all, you see that if he moves his rook, rook g1, or rook takes g7, f5 wins his queen. The queen has absolutely nowhere to go, and I win the game. So bishop e7 really forces things. If he tried the exchange sacrifice, rook takes d5, e takes d5, queen takes d5. I was up a pawn before, so now that he won one back, I'm really up in exchange. Now I can play the move bishop g4, pressuring his knight on f3, and next move I could play rook d8, attacking his queen. The bishop on d3 will be hanging. After bishop g4, knight g5, attacking mate on f7. Here I can play the very, very solid defensive move, knight d8. And here white really is overextended. His attack didn't work. My bishop on e7 is pressuring his g5 knight. I can take on h2 whenever I want. A very important part of this game now is his king is stuck on e1 because I control the c1 square, so he can't castle queenside. This position is excellent for black. White's attack is stalled. I'm preparing my own counterattack. The reason that I was a little wary of playing bishop e7 is because of another sacrificial possibility for white. He can play bishop takes g7, and when I take his rook, he can take back. Now he's threatening my rook. And after I take his pawn, rook takes h2, here he can play another powerful move, knight takes f7. And now yes, I'm up in exchange, but this position is very dangerous looking. If I take on f7, after queen g6 check, white has a big attack, and he's threatening knight d6 check, so I have to play the uncomfortable defensive move, king e7. And here I'm up in exchange, my king is not well placed. White has very, very good compensation. This isn't a great position for black. So bishop e7 allows him to play a pretty powerful exchange sacrifice. I wouldn't be surprised if you've never seen chess variations like this. Very strange attacking variations where the king has to move from e8 to e7 to defend, a white bishop placed on g7, knight placed on f7, a black rook on h2, both kings in the center. This is bizarre chess, but this is the kind of thing you often run into when you play against guys who like to mix it up. You have to be prepared to handle even the most bizarre situations. So if I had played bishop e7, as I discussed, after bishop takes g7, white would have a dangerous attack. Instead I played knight f6, stopping that. His bishop is no longer on the g7 square. His queen is attacked. He played queen f4, pressuring the f6 square. And here I missed a very important try. I played a solid defensive move which I had planned for quite some time. I played rook h6, which looks quite good. It defends the f6 square, it's protected there, it maintains all the pressure that I had on the h-file. This looks like a fine move, but what I missed was the specific possibility of queen b8, because again, important in this position is that I'm up a pawn. After queen b8, I pretty much force a trade of queens, and I'll be much better in the endgame. If he tries to interpose with a move like knight e5, then he's opening himself up to bishop d6, attacking the pinned piece. So queen b8 would have forced a trade of queens, and then I could move into the technical part of the game. His whole attacking plan would not have any real muster if I can get rid of the queens. This would have been a very strong move. To find such possibilities, you have to be completely present, not thrown off by the abnormal kind of game it is, and also not impassioned by the game. Part of the problem for me in this position, I think, was that I enjoyed this position too much. It might seem strange, but I really like games that are chaotic like this. And so a move like queen b8 didn't have the attraction to me that a move like rook h6 had, because I wanted to maintain all the tension in the game. But there's no reason to maintain tension when you're up a pawn and you can convert into an endgame where you can start to press for the win, as opposed to a position where your opponent has a big attack. So if I had been looking for very good defensive possibilities, or simplifying possibilities, queen b8 would have been pretty logical. Notice how throughout this course, whenever there's a mistake that's made, I don't only describe the chess mistake, but I also look for the root of it, look for the psychological cause for each mistake. And that process is something which, if you haven't already started, I would recommend taking on in your chess life. Always think not only about what the chess mistake was, or what the chess lesson of every game is, but what the human lesson is, what it says about yourself as a human being, and how can you grow from this as a person, not just as a player. And so my missing of queen b8 was probably caused by a number of factors. First of all, I didn't have enough of a clarity into the importance of trading off queens. If I had asked myself the question, how can I get off the queens, queen b8 or queen c7 would have popped into my head immediately. But I think more than anything else, I was involved with the romanticism of the position. I wanted to keep everything alive, and so rook h6 kept the madness in the game. After rook h6, he increased his attack in a way which would only be logical to somebody who was completely within the flow of the game, because you don't usually think of king moves in the middle game, in the midst of all this mayhem, as being a move that increases his attack. But he played king e2, a very strong move. He can't castle queenside because then I would have discoveries with my knight, and he wants to bring his rook into the game. So king e2 is well protected. His next move will be rook a to g1, increasing pressure along the g-file. So king e2 is a very good move. Here, once again, I could have played queen b8, provoking knight e5, because once again, if white trades queens, it's quite good for me. After knight e5, I would play knight takes e5. In this position, bishop d6 doesn't quite work, because after rook takes g7, the difference is that my rook on h6 is hanging. Remember before I said that bishop d6 was good for black? That was because my rook was on h8. And in this position, I would have been able to play bishop takes e5, which defends my knight, and wins a piece. But in this position, my rook on h6 hangs. Much, much less pleasant. So then what I would have played is knight takes e5, bishop takes e5, and then simply returned to b6 with my queen. The whole idea of queen b8 would have been to trade off a pair of knights. When you're being attacked, when you're being pressured, as you know, it's good to make some trades. Queen b8 would have forced one. Instead of that, I played the move knight e7. My plan was to fortify the control of the f6 square and also centralize my knight with knight e d5. If I get that move in, suddenly black's game looks very, very solid. My knight on d5 is powerful, threatens the white queen, pushes her off of the good attacking square. f6 is solidified. This is a very strong defensive idea. After knight e7, he played bishop d4. Remember the theme, the space left behind. When my knight was on c6, he controlled d4. I moved away. He played bishop d4 and began to enter the dark squares. I played queen c7. Queen b8 was another possibility. He played knight e5. So notice that my move knight e7 at once prepared a defensive plan for me and also gave him control of some of the squares which he didn't have control of before. With my knight on c6, I controlled d4 and e5. Now I played knight e7. His response was very strong. He filled the gaps, bishop d4, queen c7, knight e5. Now I play knight e d5. So I got something, and I gave him something in return. This is often how high-level chess flows. One guy gets something, the other guy gets what the other guy left. Always look for the space left behind. So you do notice that even though this is quite an atypical position, there are still chess principles that run through it. There will always be chess principles. And this is why, as a chess player, if you know the classical principles that govern all chess positions, then when things get completely chaotic, like this game, even when they're totally mad, you can still know the basic language of chess. You can still know the questions that you should ask yourself. After knight e d5, he played queen g3. Now one idea he's considering is the exchange sacrifice, rook takes g7. My pawn on g7 holds up all the dark squares, knight on f6, rook on h6. If he can make the trade, rook g7, bishop g7, queen g7, attacking my rook. If my rook moves, my knight will be looser. This is the kind of thing I have to look out for. Notice my f7 pawn is also weakened. I played queen d6, making the decision that rook takes g7 wasn't quite good yet because I have the fork, knight h5. He can prepare rook takes g7, but it's not in the game quite yet. He increased his pressure with rook g1. And now white's threat is in fact to play rook takes g7. I prevented it with knight h5. I had another idea, a very, very deep defensive idea. Take a look at it. I could have played rook to c7. This might seem completely bizarre, but it has a long-term defense of the f7 square. How does it respond to his threat? Let's take a look. After rook takes g7, knight h5, queen f3. This is possible now because his rook on g1 helps out on the g7 square. Notice that rook f6 would fall to queen takes h5. After knight takes g7, queen takes f7, king d8. Now after rook takes g7, I would have the very strong defensive move bishop to e8, attacking his queen and opening up my rook on c7 onto his queen and rook, a very strong skewer. So rook c7 in fact would have stopped his threat of rook takes g7 without moving my knight off the excellent defensive square of f6. You can probably relate this position back to the first theme that I stressed in the game I played against Gregory Kaidanov, where I discussed the idea of maintain the tension. Rook c7 here maintains the tension. It keeps all of my defensive pieces optimally placed. And also what it does is it challenges White to figure out what to do, because all of White's pieces are really well placed. He can't improve anything. His bishop on d4 is excellent. His knight on b3 can't move anywhere without being taken. His knight on e5 can't move because I'll trade queens. His rook on g5 has nowhere to go. The rook on g1 is doing everything it can. There's no way for White to really increase his pressure. And so the position seems to call for him to play the final assault, to make the move which is the climactic moment in the attack. Rook takes g7 makes sense. So the fact that a move like rook c7 defends against rook takes g7, it's a very high-level defensive move, one that I found later on in analysis, but I hadn't seen it in the game. This really would have put White's game to the brink. Instead of rook c7, I played the move knight h5, defending g7 directly. And after queen f3, knight df6. As you can see, these two moves were a little bit of a concession. Before I had this defensive structure. My knight was very well centralized, and my other one was excellently placed on f6. Now my knight on h5 does hold g7 directly, but it's on the side of the board, not nearly as well placed. And this was the critical moment of the game. White to play. What would you do? Really take your time here. Calculate everything through. This has been a crazy game, and we've reached the moment where all the tactics are coming to a head. White has to do something here, because he can't improve his game anymore. I've defended pretty well. Everything looks good. Of course, I could have played slightly better moves, like rook c7 would have been an excellent defensive chance. But now White has to figure out what he's going to do. He's got to prove his attack. On the other hand, I have a very solid defensive setup. White to play. Calculate deeply. What would you do? I find that some chess players have a misperception of what it means to be in the critical moment of the game. Some players feel that the critical moment means that the critical moment is for them, as if they've been attacking, they've been going for it, and then the critical moment is like, I'm about to win. So the critical moment means to them that the stakes are very high for one player. But that's usually not the case. Usually the stakes are very high and that the game can swing in any direction, because the tension mounts and mounts and mounts, the pressure gets more and more intense, and so as that happens, the stakes of every decision get higher and higher and higher. That's the case here. White has to play the right tactic. If he plays the wrong tactic, he'll lose. If he plays the right tactic, he could have very good chances. What have you come up with? And this is another way of dealing with positions which don't let you be certain about anything, positions which are very abnormal. Sometimes you can just calculate out. In this game, we had to both be at peace with the unknown. We had to both flow with the abnormalities of the position. And so in the critical moment, my opponent was a little bit lax. He was a little bit hesitant to enter into concrete calculation because it had been inappropriate for him to do that beforehand because there were no real variations to calculate. Now there are. The two choices for White are knight takes f7 and rook takes h5. If you hadn't seen those already, look at them now. Calculate deeply. Which would you play? I'm sure that you can guess that I had ideas in mind against both. This was a very, very intense game and we were both putting our heart and souls into it. He played knight takes f7. How would you defend with black? Well, his idea is rooted in the concept of the pinned piece. After I take back on f7, my knight on f6 will be pinned. King takes f7. Now he played rook takes h5. This looks very strong. He's taken a pawn, opened up my king. He's threatening rook takes h6, which will take my pawn away from the defense of my knight. If I play rook takes h5, he'll remove the defender with bishop takes f6. My rook is hanging. He's threatening to move his bishop away with discovery. This is a nice attack for White. But I had something in mind here. Do you see what I saw? Black to move. Take your time. What do you do? This is the critical moment. I'm sure you know the principle that when you have a piece pinned, you want to attack it. But in a position like this, when somebody is relying on you having a pinned piece, a very good way of responding to it is to attack the pinner, to unpin your piece. The key tactical idea, which he missed, and which I had seen before allowing knight takes f7, was bishop c6, a relatively quiet move. And it's very easy to miss moves like this when you're calculating knight takes f7, king takes rook takes h5, he's looking at all the captures, all the checks. Bishop c6 forces the win of the game. His queen is under attack with check, notice. If he moves to f4, maintaining the pin, I can take it. And if he moves anywhere else, his rook will hang on h5. My knight on f6 is no longer pinned. Black is doing very well. What would you do with white here? Well, a big part of this calculation was based on one deeper idea, which is that it is true. He can block the attack of my bishop on his queen with e4. But now, after rook takes h5, bishop takes f6. Do you see what I had in mind? Black to move. Find my next idea. The whole point of the defense for black is that now I can play rook f5. His pawn can't take it because it's pinned to the queen. Now he has the key pinned piece. After his queen moves, rook takes f6, I'm simply up a rook. After rook f5, the game is completely winning for black. I'll show you how he handled bishop c6 in a moment. Let me show you what he could have done. So in this position, you recall I said he had either knight takes f7 or rook takes h5. Those are his key tactical possibilities. Knight f7 will continue within a moment. As I've shown you, my key idea was the defensive pop of bishop c6. His correct move was rook takes h5. Rook takes h5, knight takes d7, queen takes d7, and bishop takes f6. Straightforward ideas, removing the defender of my rook. Here I would have played rook takes h2, and after bishop takes g7, white's game is definitely better. I have a rook and a pawn for a bishop and a knight. His king is centralized on e2, which could potentially be weak later on after a move like rook d8. My king, on the other hand, is centralized as well on e8. He can get an attack. White is better here. Not winning, but better. This was his real shot. So if you're looking for the truth of this position, what we can recall is that I had the key defensive idea of, in this position, rook c7. And here white's attack would really stall, because rook takes g7 is impossible because of the line I showed you guys. Knight h5, queen f3, knight g7, queen f7, king d8, and after rook takes g7, the very strong move bishop e8. That wouldn't work for white. After I missed the defensive idea of rook c7 and played knight h5, then after queen f3, knight df6, he had a shot. Rook takes h5 was his best, and he would have had a better game. He played knight takes f7, and here I had the defensive resource. King takes f7, rook takes h5, bishop c6. He played queen h3. Remember, after e4, my idea is rook takes h5, bishop takes f6, rook f5, solidifying my defense and winning the game. After queen h3, I wrapped it up with knight takes h5, bishop g6, king g8, bishop takes h5, queen d5, attacking the pinned piece once again. He played rook g6, and he resigned the game because my next move is obviously queen takes h5 check. I'm going to be up a rook and win the game very easily. So the key to this game was handling the unknown. We were both playing a very, very unusual position. I had possibilities, he had possibilities. We both missed moves at times during the game. And truth be told, in very, very strange games, both players will tend to miss things because they're playing types of positions they're both unfamiliar with. In fact, pretty much everybody's unfamiliar with positions like the one we played in this game. But you have to flow with the moment. Be open to every possibility. Don't be flustered by the unknown. The problem with this type of game is that many players will get thrown off by a guy like Kogan because they're not used to playing chaotic positions. They like to be able to control things. And so when they can't, they feel thrown off. They feel nervous. They're flustered by having to deal with all this chaos when they like to keep things nice and neat. But move with the struggle. Enjoy the chaos. Trust yourself. You can figure everything out.